Assalamu alaikum and a very warm welcome to my audience today. I hope you're all well. We still continue to enjoy great weather here in England. And just today, we were talking about just having a nice walk outside, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. So I hope that you're well, you're keeping well wherever you are and enjoying the sunshine. I'm very excited today because I have my inaugural interview. I have invited Brother Naveed Idrees today to just have a chat with me. He is an amazing person, I know, very inspiring, does a huge amount of work in the community. So, Assalamu alaikum, Brother Naveed, and welcome to my channel.
Welcome, Aslam Sitara, and thank you for the very highfalutin introduction.
Oh, no, that's actually going to come in a moment because I want to make sure that I do justice to your introduction because I think the audience needs to know that you do a lot. And part of me, I just sit and wonder how you manage all of that. I think that's for another time because I probably need to learn diary management from you. But let me just introduce you properly to the audience. So Hafiz Muhammad Naveed Idrees, he is based in West Yorkshire in England. He completed Hifz Mashallah at the age of 13 and completed a diploma in Arabic and studies Islamic sciences in Damascus. He has got an undergraduate degree in law and has also completed his MA in religion and education in contemporary society. He is, mashallah, a qualified teacher. He is the head teacher of Faversham Primary School in Bradford. So that's your day job. He won the Head Teacher of the Year award in 2019, the TES award. And inshallah, as part of this interview and this conversation, I will be picking up a little bit on that because he's done some cutting edge stuff for school curriculum. Brother Naveed is also involved in running a Muslim Scouts group. He's the District Commissioner Joint for Halifax, which is a town in West Yorkshire. He runs a weekend Arabic school, and he's an expert in system leadership and education. He was, mashallah, awarded the OBE, the Order of the British Empire, by Queen Elizabeth II for services to education in 2020. And Brother Naveed is also a council member of BBSI, which is the British Board of Scholars and Imams. So I think now I have done some justice to your introduction. But thank you very much. I know how busy you are, and I really appreciate you taking out the time. And I want to let the audience know as well that I've also been very privileged that you've been a teacher to my sons when they were going through the stormy teenage years. And you brought a lot of calm to their experience, and they still remember very fondly all of the tafsir classes that they used to do with you. So yes, thank you. Personal thank you as well from me. So I want to kick off by talking to you about your reflections on working in the community, because you have been doing a lot of work with your weekend Arabic school. I know that you've been running classes for teenagers. And what does this involve? How did this evolve? And what motivated you to take on this work? Because it requires such a lot of passion and energy. So what keeps you going?
Okay, then, Jazakallah, thank you for the introduction, Sitara. And it's been a privilege kind of, working in the community. And I say that it is a privilege because it genuinely is a privilege. It's something that I think as somebody who works in the community, we gain more from serving the community than we think we're giving. And I think that's my first point. I would put down all the blessings that I have in my life to this simple idea that the more you give, the more you get. For me, it's almost like a spiritual law. The more you give, the more you get. And if you are kind of focused around yourself, then the blessings in your life are limited. And for me, that leads to my kind of second spiritual law, which has been a guiding principle in my life. That I have a very simple definition of heaven and hell, and the simple definition is that if you are self-centered and everything revolves around yourself, then that is the quality of somebody who is in a state of hell. And if you are serving others and helping others and spreading compassion and kindness, then you are in a state of heaven. And that is a very simple guiding principle that I have had over the course of my life. And those two principles: the more you give, the more you get. And ultimately, this idea of serving the community is not from this idea that we can benefit people, because ultimately the benefit comes from God. It's not us. That we should never be we should never have this thought that I am helping other people, because ultimately, no, you are helping yourself to helping other people. And all you are doing is you're channeling some of the gifts and some of the privileges that God has given you in your situation, and you're channeling them. So it's almost an obligation. It's almost the zakat of the gifts that you've been given to give back, and that's what purifies the blessing that you've been given in terms of what you have. And that doesn't necessarily have to be money. It can also be your time. It can also be your attention, and it can also be your availability to people. And I think that ultimately is what kind of drives me to in terms of the community involvement. And there's another slightly more philosophical aspect to this, which is that my kind of view is that everything is kind of a manifestation of God. Nothing has its own existence. So when you are engaging with people, you are engaging with God. When you are engaging with the community, you're engaging in a relationship with God. And it always, reminds me of a question I was asked by a child actually in one of my classes, and they said, everybody talks about connecting with God in Ramadan, for example, and how do you do it practically? And I thought, what a great question, and kids come up with the best questions, because everybody talks about connecting with God, and how do you do it? And it got me thinking. And I thought, what a brilliant question. And then I thought about it, and I said, I'm going to share with you a practical model that the Prophet ﷺ, shared, which gives us a practical way of engaging with God. And this is a hadith Qudsi, a hadith that Prophet ﷺ is narrating from God in his own words. And it's a very famous hadith. And it talks about on the day of judgment, a certain person will be in the presence of God, and God will say to him, I was ill and you never visited me. And the man will turn around and say, you're the Lord of the worlds. How could you have become ill? And even if you were ill, I would have been the first there to visit you. And God will remind him and say, well, on such and such occasion, a certain person was ill, and had you gone to visit him, you would have found me there.
Mm.
And then it goes on, and I was hungry, and you never gave me anything to eat. And I was thirsty, and you never gave me anything to drink. And the punchline, all of these, is that if you had done that, you would have found me there. God is saying you would have found me there. And what is really insightful in this hadith is that it shows you that your engagement with God is through people. God is saying, that if you had visited that person out, you would have found me there. If you'd have fed the hungry person, you'd have found me there. That was me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really powerful insight into the way you relate with people, that almost God is saying, that is me. That is me. And that changes the way you engage with everybody. And I remember building on this. I remember I was coming back on a bus one day from work. The trains weren't working, there were strikes.
Mm.
And I got to the bus, and there was a homeless man with really dirty clothes and really ragged beard, and everybody, he walked onto the bus, and everybody kind of flinched and moved back. And and I thought to myself, it's really interesting that everybody's moving away from this person, and yet God says, I am with the poor.
Yes.
God identifies himself with the vulnerable.
Yes.
And I thought this is such an amazing thing, that you find God in the places where you don't expect to find him. And in both of these hadiths, and in these contain the concept that you find God through relationships, through people. And so your engagement with people isn't just a utilitarian or transaction relation where you're benefiting them, or you're getting some benefit from them. It's a spiritual one, because you're engaging with God and you engage with God through people, through relationships, as well as through nature. And both of these ideas are mentioned in the Quran again and again, about nature, about the environment, about pondering upon God's creation. So this kind of bigger philosophical idea is something that I think, if one imbibes into their thinking, every moment, every interaction with every human being is an absolutely spiritual one.
Yeah.
And it doesn't become a chore. Doesn't become something that you're doing. You're engaging ultimately with God with every interaction you have.
Yeah. And that's brilliant and really inspiring to hear. And actually, it's quite unusual to have this emphasis, if I may, bring my cynical self here, because unfortunately, when we're teaching Islam to children, to younger people, we tend to emphasize a lot on worship, on ibadah. There's a lot, and I'm not saying that that's not important. We tend to emphasize a lot, even when we see adults around us, they will do extra nafil prayers, they might do a lot of zikr, etc. But this connection with human beings is often not that powerful. And I think sometimes there is too much emphasis on ritualistic worship, which takes us away from what I also believe is the essence of Islam, that we try to do our very best with any of the privileges or talents that have been given us to make a difference. And that difference might be something really tiny. As you've said, just a conversation with a homeless person, just to ask them their name, for example, to validate the experience that they've had, is not going to make a material difference to that person, but it'll make them feel visible and validated. And sometimes I think the importance of those interactions is missed out. Whereas I always feel when I read the Quran, and when I'm reading the Quran, I teach my friends' daughters on a Friday evening. And when I say teach, it's very conversational. It's mostly conversation centered around the Quran verses. Every time Allah says that you stand up for prayer, waqimus salat, the next thing he says is waqimus zakat. Every time. So it's almost as if Allah is saying to us, the moment you finish your prayer, the moment you finish your worship, your attention should be taken up with charity. And charity is about how we relate to people, how we relate to the environment, not just the money we give out in charity, but actually that interaction. And so the emphasis in the Quran is incredible throughout, but somehow in a traditional religious circles, it's all about how many nafil and how you stand in your prayer.
That's a really interesting observation. And can I just pick up a few things on that? Because you mentioned quite a few things there. So let's pick up the idea of worship. And I was talking to somebody recently. I started the golf this year, and we were talking about this idea of worship, that it's such an alien concept in our culture. I can't find anything in my lived experience other than outside of the church or the mosque or the temple where this idea of worship I can connect with in a grounded way. It's such an alien concept in modern life, and we don't see the idea of worship being implemented around us. And so when you start looking at this idea of the terminology that we use, a lot of the terminology that we use has become very religious. In a way, it's become very, very theological.
It is theological.
And it's taken away from our lived experience. And whereas the concept of ibadah was supposed to be a very natural, normal thing. And when you look at the idea of ibadah, the way I look at it, it's not this idea of just bowing your head down and, like you mentioned, the rituals. And I think there's a very important place for rituals because habit and structure it frees up memory, it frees up time for us to focus on the most important things. So I'm not against rituals at all, but I think rituals have to be embedded in lived ground experience, and that the ritual shouldn't just become a hollow thing. It should be promoting something. So the way I look at worship is alignment. So alignment means you're aligning yourself with the core values and attributes of God, which is compassion, kindness, and justice. So if you're in alignment with God, you are worshiping. And prayer is the ultimate symbol of alignment with God, where you're showing your submission to God's complete will and His laws that are there, both spiritual, in the natural world, in the political world. So that complete alignment. So this links with another hadith that's been one of the driving forces behind my kind of approach, which is adopt the character of God. Adopt the attributes of God, and the ultimate attribute of God is kindness and compassion. And so if you're in alignment with those values, then you are living in a state of worship. And so this idea of rituals becoming empty is because they're no longer grounded in our lived experience that we can identify with. So that's I think it's a very important point you kind of raised, and I think that applies to a lot of other concepts like taqwa, tawakkul, all the concepts that we mention, like salah, for example, and zakat you mentioned. So salah is basically your vertical relationship, and zakat is your horizontal relationship with people. And both of these are there. And something you mentioned about when you read the Quran. Now, recently I've been doing a little research project on looking at the chronological order of the Quran and cross-referencing it with the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. So how did the revelation that came down then intersect with the Prophet's reality at that time historically? And what you'll find is that the Meccan period, it is very little focus on theology, but
Yes.
most of it on social justice and social responsibility. And I can give you a really, really, really powerful example is that one of the early surahs in the Quran is Surah Al-Qalam. And Surah Al-Qalam talks about the people of the garden and of rich people taking the means of production and excluding. And there's nothing about worship there at all. And that this whole surah is about this. Surah Fajr is another example, where it says, "Kalla bal la tukrimun al-yatim." Says, man complains about it, says, well, God says, no, it's because you don't honor the orphan and you don't help people, vulnerable people in society.
That's right.
So you can see that the whole thrust of the Quran, in the chronological order, it goes from this idea of social responsibilities. The first is that connection with God. So Iqra bismi rabbika allazi khalaq. So you recognize, and the word Rabb is used, for example. So what you'll find is that in the early surahs, the word Allah isn't even mentioned.
No, the word Rabb is mentioned as the provider. Yeah.
Because that's your experience of growing up, your experience of surviving, living, existence, being. So everybody has this idea, that something's nurturing you, something's growing you, something, because you're not controlling anything of your physical functions. Even my heartbeat now, I'm not controlling consciously my breathing, and all the biological mechanisms that are. So we know that there is something there. And this idea of starting from lived experience is very, very important. And I think I want to just bring about this idea of worship. You can't worship unless you're connected with something bigger than yourself.
Yes.
And sometimes I think the word God and the word Allah, because we've used in a theological fashion, people don't discover and develop this relationship with something bigger. So I find it's very useful to start off first with talking about the source. What is the source of all of this? The force. And we know there's some force that's controlling everything. There's intelligence out there. You can't, even somebody like Richard Dawkins, the author of the God Delusion, says, you have to be stupid to deny that there is signs of intelligence in the universe. Yeah, you can't deny it. And people are coming this fine tuning of the even modern physicists now. They're accepting that the fine tuning of the universe indicate there is some power, some force, some consciousness, some super intelligence. So I think it's really important that the idea of worship is first grounded in your reality of your existence, first of all. So you understand that there's somebody providing for you, there's some force, there's some intelligence, there's some consciousness out there, and that consciousness, as a result of all of that, I'm here. And so once you've gone through that process, then you're on your journey to connecting with the ultimate idea of Allah or God. But what happens is, because if you've inherited God as a theological concept, you will have no idea. And I'll just share an anecdote with you while we're on this. One of the imams I know of a very big mosque in our local area in Bradford, and I was talking to him, and I says, I can't understand this idea that at Jummah, some of the people that are are involved in wrong actions, maybe dealing drugs or whatever, they're in the first row of the Jummah namaz. And yet, I can't square this with this idea of them being really, really praying, and then as soon as they leave the mosque, they go out and there's a total disconnect. And I said, why is that? I can't understand why. And he said, okay, well, the reason for that is because they see religion as something separate to life.
Yeah. It's a compartmentalization.
And this goes back to this idea, we've made religion into a theological, a religious concept, whereas it was something that was supposed to improve your life, improve your well-being, improve your relationships, improve your family, your local area, your country, your nation, the world, rather than just a boxed idea of religion.
Yeah.
In the idea. And so the reason why there's a disconnect is because our religion isn't grounded on our lived, experienced.
Mhm.
So we have religion, and then we have a lived experience, which are
Yes.
two different
They're two
codes.
different things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And I sometimes use the phrase selfish Jannah. Me and my Jannah, which is, well, I'm doing my nafal, I'm doing my prayer, I'm doing my fasting. I have now found my Jannah. And I see this conceptualization to be inherently selfish because you said earlier, then we're only thinking about ourselves and we're not thinking about the impact that we have on people around us and what change we can bring into this world. And I think people often also forget that we have to live well in this world to be able to secure that Jannah anyway. This is the path. This is the path we have to take in this life. It's the choices we make here that we'll bear the fruits of or not. And I think that's often forgotten. I think another thing that's often forgotten is people become so outcome focused, the selfish Jannah, that they forget that what Allah is demanding from us is to walk the path, the Sirat Mustaqim. The idea is to follow the process, to walk the path one foot after another and make good choices every time you do that. And those choices should benefit us, but benefit other people. I mean, I'm in my view, and I say this to my sons and I say this to other young people as well, that if they're going to plant a flower and it attracts birds and bees and butterflies, then that is also a very great act of sawab because they've done something, that this tiny change they've made to try to stop the loss of biodiversity, this tiny change they've made to try to stop climate change is actually, in my view, a very, very amazing gesture. And we see examples of that, we see examples of that from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he often says that somebody will be forgiven because he saw a thirsty animal and gave it a glass of water, a bowl of water. And he talks about how the people closest to him in Jannah are going to be the people who raise orphans or look after orphans. So, if in throughout Hadith literature, the emphasis has always been benefiting other people with your actions, trying to do something good
And
for,
to me, that I think is the crux of the matter. Why would you care about people if they're just people?
yeah.
Yeah, because you're othering them.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
and that's why I mentioned, at the start about this philosophical view that if you see them as as a manifestation linked with the divine, then your relationship with people will not be in an exploitative fashion because
Exactly.
you don't see them as people, you see them as if. And I mean, I came across a really nice quote the other day, and it says, we are holes in the lampshade through which God's light shines through.
Mm-hmm.
All of us, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
all of us are just holes in the lampshade to which God's light shines through. So all of us are reflecting that, and I think that is what's missing. We don't see the divine aspect of humans, and this goes back to a fundamental scheme in the Quran, and this idea about the story of Iblis and
Mm-hmm.
Adam, and we read it just as a story, but actually it's a organizing principle. It really puts our human existence into context, and it gives us the rules of the game.
Mm-hmm.
In the opening of the Baqarah, and the way this happens, for example, Iblis, all he saw was the physical aspect of Adam. He saw he was made out of clay.
Yeah.
What he didn't see was the divine aspect that he was
Exactly. The
carrying.
divine spirit
The
inside
breath
all
of
of us.
God.
Exactly.
You couldn't see that.
No.
So if you see people just as purely physical, material people, biological people, and you don't see that they have this divine spark which makes them human.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they're just the flesh. They're not really human. What makes them human is the ruh, is the وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, I breathed into him my spirit.
My spirit, exactly.
And so that is the same mentality that Iblis exemplified, which we see, which is leading to this injustice and exploitation of either in an individual relationship or within a family unit or on an international scale where, for example, we're okay to sell arms because it helps our economy.
Yeah.
And as long as our people are not suffering, it's okay.
Exactly. The
And that will
imperialism.
but that will only happen because you don't see people as humans.
No.
They're
not
only
connected.
And the moment you see the other human being as a divine person, somebody who's manifesting, is like a little mirror who's reflecting the image of the divine, then your relationship with that person, you're not honoring that person, you're honoring what he's carrying.
Mm-hmm.
What he or she is carrying.
Yeah.
And I think otherwise, if we don't change that, over the last 200 years, imperialism and colonialism and globalization, all of this, we see the world and people as objects to exploit.
Yeah.
We don't see any divinity in the earth, any sanctity or sacredness of the earth, so we exploit it. We don't
Or
see any
human
sanctity
relationships. We don't
for
even
people.
see sanctity and sacredness in human relationships anymore. I mean, the collapse of marriage in society now is an example of that. We don't
Absolutely.
give sanctity
And
to relationships.
and that again is like, I mean, when you talk about marriage, I always say that people forget the third element in your relationship, which is God. If your relationship goes only via you two,
Yeah.
then it's not going to last.
No.
If it goes via the ark of God, yeah, that will be a lasting relationship, because you're not reacting to just the person. There is, you're bringing another element. The ground of your relationship is in God rather than each other. And if it's in each other, it won't last, because you will just see the humanness of each other rather than the divineness of each other.
Yeah.
And I think that triangle is so important to say.
Yeah.
And we're brought up to think again, what can I get from the partner? And it's again all material and
it's very
extreme.
utilitarian, isn't it? Where is my gain?
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's post-enlightenment thinking. And the tragedy is that the Islamic tradition actually gives us so much rich material to counter some of these post-enlightenment philosophies, this very positivistic way of thinking, this very utilitarian, even conceiving of, I was writing in my thesis as well, even conceiving of human beings as homo economicus, that all we care about is the economy and how we maximize our utility. But that's not the reality of how we live. We buy things not because they maximize utility, but because we happen to like them, or they taste nice, or they look nice. It's all very emotional. But this is the world we live in. And the tragedy is that because of the decline that we've seen in Islamic intellectual thought, we have not been able to revive our or mature our philosophical tradition enough to act as a bulwark, as a dam against this, and to stop the onslaught of this philosophy, which of course now is all consuming. I mean, we've seen just yesterday, I was reading in The Guardian that 800 million trees have been taken down in the Amazon rainforest. You know why? To raise cattle, to raise beef, because humans eat so much meat. So here is the Yajuj Majuj of the Quran, which are literally eating the planet. We are literally eating the planet, the only planet we have. And I'm sure we could go on around philosophy and the post-enlightenment and post-modern world we live in.
I just want to pick up on something you said there. You're absolutely right. So you've got the utilitarian level, and then above that we have the emotional. And I think there's been a big focus on emotions over the last 20-30 years.
Yes.
And we've seen that in education, where we're teaching children about emotional intelligence and emotional well-being. And what the interesting thing is that this still hasn't made us happier or children happier at all. So there's something that's still missing from the equation.
And that's the spiritual. That's the spiritual. Yeah.
And I think so. This is the things like, and I know you mentioned the introduction about my work in education. And one of the philosophies I've been driven by is that children have a soul. Yeah, they're not just a body or a mind. And if you can address the soul aspect, and the soul aspect responds to what? Beauty. Yeah, that's where art, music,
nurture.
These things come in. Nurture. Nature, they connect you with something bigger than yourself.
Yes, that's right.
So basically, you're laying the foundations of a spiritual being by engaging the child's soul with the higher things in life. So art, music, poetry. So that's the reason for focusing on these cultural capital ideas, because it connects you with something deeper. And so what I found is that if you focus on that aspect, you immediately set a very high bar. So I mean, I work in Bradford, in a very deprived, disadvantaged area, and for about 20 years, the school I was in and the community I was in was kind of written off. And head after head came in and said, okay, it's basically an issue of lack of cultural capital, and it's social demographics, it's the ethnicity, it's the education levels, it's the poor housing.
Speaking English as a second language for many children. Yeah.
And the problem is you can't escape from those factors.
No.
Those factors, you are born into those factors. And if you are limited by those external metrics, you're never going to break that cycle. No. But if you say that, your soul is unlimited, the capacity of the soul has no limits.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can focus on the capacity of the child's soul, we are breaking all limits and barriers for that child to achieve whatever it wants to achieve.
Mm.
Yeah. And this way of thinking is basically, it's almost like a spiritual curriculum where you're laying the foundations. It's not just about information or learning equations or learning how to do maths or learning facts, but it's actually the child's grounding in it's a holistic way of looking at all the domains of human beings, and it's a spiritual education. And here's a really ironic thing, that the first kind of iteration of the national curriculum we had was in 1944 Education Act. And in the act, the idea of spiritual education was at the center of that curriculum. And since that time, every iteration of the curriculum has contained this idea of spiritual education. Even in the latest 2014 curriculum iteration, you have the idea of spiritual, moral, social, cultural education. And yet that is completely abandoned, where our focus on exams and our focus on information. And yet this thing has remained constant throughout the history in the UK about putting spiritual learning at the heart of education. And yet it's honored more in the breach than following it. Which is ironic.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because how do you discuss spirituality? How do you even discuss the soul in a highly secularized society where the whole idea of God is seen as irrational? It is often, there isn't much space to talk about God, or how the idea of God infuses for Muslims particularly, and I have these conversations at work, that this idea of God and our faith, how it infuses everything we do, every thought we have, every conversation we have, every action we take, we soak it up, don't we? We imbibe it. I think it's in every blood cell we have, every strand of DNA. But it's really difficult in highly secularized spaces to even talk about God. And I actually want to pause here just for 1 second for the benefit of our audience and actually just give them a little bit of background, because I did say earlier on as well that you won the Head Teacher of the Year award, and one of the reasons for that was the curriculum you brought. And I want to set out the context here that you brought out that curriculum which is emphasizing, as you're saying, that kind of nurturing curriculum, the spiritual development of children. You've put beauty, aesthetics, music, the aesthetical joys that our souls have, art and music at the center of your curriculum. How was that received? I mean, this is very radical because you are serving primarily a Muslim community. We know that the Muslim community in Britain, by and large, tends to be quite conservative. So how was this received? Did you have parents protesting at the school gate?
No, that's a really interesting question. I think, first of all, I think it's a myth. It's a misconception that Muslims are against music, and it's the definition of how do you define music. So, for example, I was talking to a Qari from Egypt, somebody who studied the 10 Qira'ats, and they was talking about the musical skills they use when they're reciting the Quran, and the biggest musical instrument is your voice. Yeah. And so when we talk about music, so in Islamic tradition, there's two different things. Music was associated in the past with establishments that were a place for sin.
Yes.
So dancing girls and alcohol and so on. So it was by association. Music in itself, when we talk about music, what do we mean? We're talking about how to use the human voice, which is completely, is completely existent, and it's being utilized in our tradition through the idea of the Tajweed and recitation of the Quran and the Azan and so on. So the idea was trying to bring it separate. And what we did is actually you connect the community to its own sources. So we focus on the Nasheeds, for example, and in a lot of the communities that we serve, they come from very Sufi backgrounds as well. And so music has been part of
Sufism,
Islamic culture for decades. And again, when we talk about music, we're not talking about the thing. So music is just like a tool. It's a tool that you can use for good or for bad.
Or misuse,
Or misuse, And the content obviously can be whatever the content you have. So for us, it was more an idea that children are connecting with this domain of learning, with this domain of being human, and you're building on. So I think it's absolute myth. So for example, the solfa scale, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, that was invented in Islamic Spain.
Yes, it was.
So this is again something I found very, very interesting was that a lot of the community that we serve, if you go back to the generation before the migration, they had a lot of music and a lot of singing and poetry in their culture.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
it
we
was
do. In Pakistan, we do. Yeah.
completely there.
But I think it's the politics of where we find ourselves now, isn't
No.
it? The
So
austerity, the austere
what happened,
Muslim.
but
Yeah.
what happened is that when
Yes.
that generation came, that link with their tradition was broken, and they didn't
Yes.
find any means of connecting with that tradition.
Yes.
So because the focus was purely on economic survival, building families, building businesses, building communities, and it's a huge, huge challenge that you're coming to a country that you don't know.
Mm.
And so the focus became completely purely economical. We stopped producing culture.
Yes,
And this
that's
is,
right.
this is one of my other big ideas that, as a community, we should stop becoming consumers of culture, but we should become producers of
Mm-hmm.
culture.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a sign of a healthy. And we were talking about God's attributes earlier. God's fundamental attribute is creation.
Yes. And beautiful,
Creativity,
beautiful creation.
beauty,
He
and
talks about
creativity.
beautiful creation. Yes.
Beauty and creativity is the essence
Yes.
of the divine. Yeah.
Yes.
And so when you're connecting with creativity and beauty, you're laying the foundations of a very solid relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's the kind of philosophical thinking behind the approach.
Yeah.
And ultimately it works academically as well, because the child is relaxed, they were connected with something higher and bigger than themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And in this culture, music is probably one of the only last things remaining that allows people to connect with something deeper, something non-material, non-physical.
That's
Yeah,
right.
to a
Yeah.
human being. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's one,
Yeah.
probably the last thing that remains. When you
Mm-hmm.
when people listen to a piece of music, for example, it isn't their brain or mind that's responding to it. There's
Yeah.
something else
At an
there.
emotional level. Yeah.
Not even emotion, at a spiritual level.
Yeah, at a spiritual level as well.
And so that's something you're connected,
Mm.
your connection with something non-physical. And ultimately, we are metaphysical beings. If you
Yes.
look at what makes us human, it's our thoughts, which is non-physical, emotions, non-physical, our memories, non-physical. So
Mm.
what ultimately matters to us humans, what makes us human, is the metaphysical. It's
Yeah.
our dreams, our memories, our emotions, not our physical,
No. No.
body. So it's ultimately a myth that the Muslim community is against music. That's
Yeah.
not really true at all.
Yeah.
There are some traditions. When you say Muslim community, there's a range spectrum. There's a massive spectrum. There will be some people who will say, okay, absolutely,
Yeah.
haram, and other people say, everything goes. But
Yes.
actually, it's about, we're looking at the principles. So, so when we're talking about music, we're talking about the fundamentals of using sound.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the human voice, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so in that sense, it wasn't um, a controversial thing at
Mm-hmm.
all, because we weren't promoting any particular type of music or any
Yeah.
particular type of
Or in
content.
particular kind of culture which might be
Culture,
objected
no,
to,
no.
isn't it? And
It's
it's
basically
the
teaching kids how to use
connection.
the principles. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, for example, I've come across a book where the Quran, some of the qaris have been analyzed, and they put the musical notation. They are following
Mm-hmm.
principles of musical principles
Yeah.
to beautify the voice,
Yeah.
and
And the
so
Quran is very lyrical. And the Quran, so
yeah.
many verses of the Quran are very lyrical.
So the issue with music is it was people's associations with it.
Yeah.
And historically, in the Islamic tradition, in the Islamic culture, music was so associated with establishments that were
Yeah.
promoting vice. And
Exactly.
that was in the mind. And
Yeah.
so people talk about, so when you define music, what is music? What do we mean by that?
Yeah.
We're talking about how we use the voice, how we
Yeah.
use scales,
Yeah.
pitch, rhythm,
It's the
timbre.
harmony.
It's
Yeah.
all of that is how we use that.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
so in that sense, it really is a myth that
Yeah.
Muslims are against. We're not against it at all.
Mm.
And so the one final point on this is that sometimes people are against music because if it's presented from a um, culturally insensitive way.
Yeah.
So if it appears like somebody's imposing it on you, okay, and that is a really wrong way to do it as well.
Yeah.
And so for example, what we did is my music teacher, he engaged with the community, and we used nasheeds and devotional aspects of naats and hamd and so on to engage the community. Say, this is your tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And this is
your
where it's
tradition.
important, isn't it? It's grounded in the culture of that community. And I think it's really important to highlight, emphasize what a good model that is, because we do know for a fact that in Muslim communities, often children are encouraged to study the sciences in their professions. Very rarely do I see Muslim parents encouraging their child to learn music. We know how incredibly difficult it is to learn music. It requires great talent, great intelligence to be able to create music. We know that the Quran does not forbid music, but the Quran forbids in Surah Al-Araf is fahisha.
Yeah.
It forbids indecency. So indecency in music would make that music haram. But if there is no indecency in music, there is no problem with music, because music is actually all around us. It is a creation of the divine. And as you were saying, it speaks to kind of that aesthetic, spiritual, emotional, psychological self. It's really nourished and energized by it. That's why we also enjoy the Quran recitation so much. When we hear a beautiful recitation, it moves us, it gives us goosebumps. And I think it also, coming back to your use of it in the curriculum, probably instills a lot of self-discipline in children, because to learn music, you need that work ethic, you need the self-discipline, you need the intellectual engagement, and that would probably feed into all of the other subjects they're studying, such as English and maths and sciences.
And I think that's the key point, the transferable skills that I meant. So, for example, you're learning pattern spotting, which is supposed to be in maths. You learn to use language, and when you're learning all the words, the lyrics, the songs, that's supporting you in English, and the discipline required. It really immense, and that then had an impact on standards.
Yes,
had an impact on standards. So these children achieve greatly because they are grounded, they're connected with their self.
And the learning. They're connected with the learning that they're enjoying.
You were talking about, in a secular age. See, I don't see it in those terms at all. See, I think you look at the concept of God. The word God is just a placeholder for the unknown, the mystery of the universe.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows the essence of God at all. It's just people in engagement with existence, with being. So God for me is a placeholder, and what you attach to that placeholder is whatever you want. And ultimately, this idea that there's some force, some power out there that is keeping this fine-tuned universe into being, and nobody rejects that.
No.
And actually, I think now this hard, muscular secularism, atheism is disappearing.
Yes.
And especially if you look at the advances of quantum physics, and people can't explain. And so this idea of fine-tuning is accepted as the standard version of events now, that there is fine-tuning. And so I think this idea of God is, we need to take the idea of God out of the theological domain. It's not a theological idea. The idea of God is being. Yeah, you're engaging with entire being. Yeah, the fact that being exists, that is, so your first connection with being, with God, is your existence. With being, and that's your starting point.
Yeah,
and so
that can be quite ecumenical. That can be ecumenical, for people who are secular, people who are Muslim, Jewish, Christian, doesn't matter. It's an idea that everybody can gravitate around.
Yes, and I think this is what's missing now. We haven't got a concept of engaging with something higher than ourselves, something we've worked through and come to a conclusion that there is something higher there, and I can feel it the way I engage with the world, my faculties, my capacity. The world is designed for me to notice these things, and that idea of grounding your connection with something higher, and I think naturally the world. Academics are moving towards this now, where they're coming towards the idea that there could be an explanation behind this, and then ultimately, I mean, I was talking to a journalist a couple of weeks ago, and this journalist is discovered spirituality, and coming from a secular background. And what was really fascinating was that what I was saying and what he was saying was exactly the same, in the sense that you're connecting with the deep aspect of being human. And that is what essence of worship is. That's what the essence of God is, that it's something higher. So God is ultimately the absolute beauty, absolute knowledge. It's something that humans aspire towards, ultimate perfection. Yeah. It's a placeholder for that ultimate perfection. It's not, but then people have defined God in their own way.
Yes.
And some in a very narrow sense, in a very theological sense.
And then they disagree.
It's taking God out of the sphere of being relevant to you.
Yeah.
And therefore has no power over you at all, this idea.
Yeah.
And so for me, First we have to lay the foundations of belief in God, of something higher power, and that comes through first connecting with the deep aspects of being human,
Yeah.
and that is your soul. And the soul manifests itself through the arts, through creativity, through culture. And that lays the ground, the foundation. And actually, if you look at Surah Al-Fatiha, for example, it gives you a complete journey to God.
Yes,
So you start off, for example, you praise, alhamd, praise and gratitude. So you notice things around you first, and wow, and
the sustainer of all the worlds.
You express the beauty, and then you realize, okay, this force is benefiting me. I didn't put all these powers and attributes into plants and materials. There is some power that's made it happen. This fine-tuned universe is there. And then you move to the idea of Rabbil Alameen, that this power is nurturing everything in the universe.
And it's a compassionate power. And it's a compassionate power.
You realize it's giving abundance in the abundant, compassionate. And then you realize there's accountability as well, Malik Yawmiddin. There's the accountability that because of God, I've got all these gifts, that with that comes accountability. And so if you look at the first part of Al-Fatiha, it's always the third person.
Yes, it is.
And then you move towards the personal relationship. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, the personal relationship. And so that's the journey. And we haven't even completed the first phase yet. We don't ground the first phase before we can move to the second phase. And the first phase is through your observation of things around you, yourself, people around you, events around you. So how does God reveal himself? And we mentioned a few things before. He reveals that through human relationships, through history, through nature, through events that happen, and through revelation, and ultimate things that we can't access. And so you build this idea of there is some force, there is some power that is governing, and then ultimately, can I have a relationship with that power?
But that relationship with that power is stronger through our relationship with people around us, the people, the planet, the animals, the birds, the bees, the butterflies, the plants, everything. And this is, but I do think that, the point you've made about the nurturing the aesthetic is really important here. We know Professor Khalid Abul Fadl talks about beauty a lot in his the book that he's written, Reasoning with God. He says that beauty is the ultimate and the highest value in Islam. So the idea of the Sharia, the idea of living a spiritual life is to achieve that beauty and harmony and balance. That's how he envisages it. So I think he provides us with that framework in which we can ground some of that thinking. But then it also gets me thinking when I read the Quran and how the Quran addresses human beings. If we notice how Allah talks to human beings, he always sees us in this whole holistic sense. And I think the unfortunate tragedy we have is certainly in the last 40 odd years, and I think Islamic tradition primarily, the way it's taught, the way it reaches us, tends to be very rule oriented, do's and don'ts, binaries, halal, haram, yes, no rules. And so what it does is it only ever appeals or nurtures the rational bits of human beings. So here is a little theory, right? I'm going to say this now. This is my theory. And I haven't written anything serious about it. But I've started to see human beings and the way the Quran sees human beings as embodying three different aspects, right? One is the rational, right? That's the rational, where our reason wants the rules and the do's and don'ts, and how do I do this and how do I do that, and how do I, share my inheritance, and how do I marry somebody, and how does divorce happen, etc. And then you have the aesthetic, which we've discussed at length. That's the aesthetic aspect of ourselves. And then there's the spiritual. So when the Quran addresses that, it picks up all three of those aspects. It looks at ourselves, at humans in totality. Whereas I think, unfortunately, when we impart religious knowledge, either we emphasize the spiritual to the extent that we don't emphasize the rational or the aesthetic, or we tend to emphasize the spiritual and the rational, but completely do away with the aesthetic. And I think we have suffered as a community. I think that softness that comes from nurturing the aesthetic in our souls, the love of beauty, the love of creation, the love of art, love of drawing, color, music, has actually, I do feel that it's hardened our thinking somehow, made it quite austere, quite puritanical. And it's a tragedy, and it's joy for me to listen to you speak about trying to nurture that in our children. And I hope that there are some children in your school who go and study music and arts when they go to university. And I always say this: the Muslim community needs the thinkers It needs the creative artists. It needs the music,
Absolutely.
musicians. It needs the
And,
historians and the philosophers, not just the doctors and the engineers and the accountants, right?
and like I was saying before, we need to be producers of culture.
Yes, and that's how
Yeah.
we produce culture, by
And
bringing
but
talent to that.
we don't produce culture.
No,
We
because we're
consume
not
it,
bringing our talented children to culture. Yeah.
and we don't create the infrastructure. But I think just picking up on that
Yeah.
point you mentioned, as a generalization, as a community, we don't focus on the aesthetic anymore. And I think there's a fundamental reason for that. And one is the trauma of colonialism.
Yeah.
It ripped apart our societies. It
And
ripped
our
apart the
identity,
funding,
our sense of identity, our
patronage,
culture, our
identity,
traditions. Yes,
completely. And so we're still dealing with all of that.
we are.
It ripped apart our financial institutions, it ripped apart our patronage systems and
Yes,
structures that allowed all of that to happen.
yes,
And so we're trying to find our way
yes.
still through that. And the legal system has remained because it's probably the one that's easiest to visibly see and to connect with. Yeah. And for me, it's like the fiqh, the legal approach. That's just one lens.
It's
Yeah.
just one lens. It's just one bit
And
of
here,
our lives.
let me
Yeah.
put a question to you here, which is really, so, like, for example, I mentioned before that if you look at the chronological order of the Quran, we don't get any rulings until much later. Yet, in the final version of the Quran that we have, which is also agreed by the Prophet ﷺ and dictated by the divine, Surah Baqarah, which is a purely legalistic, heavily legalistic surah, comes first. Okay? And I was reflecting on this. Why is Surah Baqarah first, and yet all the spiritual and the social responsibilities surahs are towards the end of the Quran. And for me, and I mean, I went through a similar journey to yourself. You go through a journey where you think all of the legalistic is you have a reaction towards it.
Yes.
Because it's not. But actually, I think we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what's really important is, like, for example, in education, when we're helping children, habit and routine are absolute rituals are so fundamentally important to give people a structure to their lives.
Yeah.
And so the rituals are there to support and aid and nurture and nourish that content.
Provided they remain proportional. Provided they remain
but I think
proportionate.
what happens, because what happens is that the problem that you've identified is that the rituals have become purely important for the sake of being rituals, rather than them promoting and nurturing, and we've forgotten that. Like we talked about worship, ibadah isn't just doing nafal, ibadah is aligning yourself with the divine. And that act of alignment then, it gives you a concept. So one of the fundamental things that we need to do as a community is we need to take our standard sayings and phrases and concepts, terminology, and then ground it in our lived experience today. And for your listeners out there, I'm going to put a challenge out. Look at Surah Yusuf. In Surah Yusuf, so many of the theological concepts that we have today are put in a very relationship kind of context, and you can see all of those ideas are conveyed, and you can see the meaning. For example, what salihat means, what taqwa means, in a context of relationships, rather than in the context of theology. So the theological definitions came later. So I think the first step is we have to recover the meaning of these terms from a lived experience, and then we can follow them, apply them. Otherwise, they will be divorced from our lives completely. We follow them when we go to masjid, or when we're talking religious talks. Other than that,
and that's it. You come out the door, and then you've forgotten all about it.
So that's the first step. And the second, I want to kind of you mentioned the word identity, and I think for me, I want to share a little personal anecdote with you. That in my career and in my life, I always for example, when I was at school, I was in school with a majority white population. There was only about 6 of us, and then even in my career, I've been surrounded by people ethnically different and so on. And so you get this idea that you're always seen as an ethnic minority, and that label itself puts you in a mindset that you are different, you are limited, you are lower, and so on. And for me, I went through this idea of actually my core identity isn't defined by my nationality or by my ethnicity or my socioeconomic status or my occupation. My core identity goes back to this concept of Abdullah. Yeah. And this concept I took from Surah Maryam, where when Isa alayhi salam, the first when Maryam, peace be upon her, she came and she brought in and her community accused her, said, "Oh, what is this?" And she pointed to the child, and the child spoke. And the first words that Jesus spoke in the Quranic tradition is "Inni Abdullah." Yeah, he didn't say I am Jesus or he says I am Abdullah. And this Abdullah gives you the identity. Your identity, it comes through your relationship with God. Yeah. Not through your family or through your nationality or your ethnicity. And that grounding, then nobody can break into that. Nobody can destroy that, because you're connected with something such bigger, powerful, higher than any other being. And your identity is Abdullah. This, you are the servant of Allah. And in passing, I'll also mention one of the meaning of the word abada is to take an imprint of something. Yeah. So you take on the imprint of the qualities of God, and then that grounds you, and then you don't experience all this, trauma that we experience with the community, because we are reacting to how people have defined us. And so this
and the
kind
sense of victimization that comes, which is so debilitating for our community.
Absolutely.
I mean, I can't tell you how many times I speak about this.
Completely.
The belligerence, the headbutting, the confrontational. Now this has been done to us, that has been done to us. I think it's completely disempowering, those victim narratives.
For me, this is going back, so I never saw myself as a victim.
No.
And, and I've done well in my career, and even I was surrounded by, even like now when I go to these meetings, I'm the only brown face.
Yeah, same. Often in my case.
But that never, I never feel inferior or overwhelmed by any of this, because I know that my identity, my core being, is that thread that connects me with the divine.
Exactly.
We were talking before, what makes us human is that divine breath and that divine ruh, that spirit inside us. So our identity, and I think this is so important for children. We need to be taught that they first relate, and I'll mention this in passing, that our families are going through a lot of trauma as well. Children are, working in education, we come across this all the time. Children's families are broken, and a lot of children are just experience broken families and trauma informed childhoods, and that can have a massive impact on the child. It can ruin the rest of their life.
Yes, and then there is chronic consequences that they carry with them into their adulthood, into their middle age.
So I was the journalist I was talking to the other day, and he was talking about this idea that childhood trauma. And I said, what? Let me give you an example of a person. Say, imagine there's somebody whose father dies before they're even born, okay, and then their mother dies, when they're about 5-6 years old, and then they go into care of the grandfather, and the grandfather dies when they're 9, 10, and then they take the care. And this person, how are you going to predict the future of this person? And this person has huge issues, attachment issues and identity issues and so on. And I said, this is the example of our prophet. He went through all this trauma, and it shows you actually that we're looking in the wrong way. But his identity was Abdullah. And then we say this in Salah, Abduhu. And this Abduhu is an immense title for the prophet. And for us, being Abdullah is an immense privilege for us, that we're connecting with something which transcends human categories. And that raises, you go above all of this, and then you don't have the victimization thing.
And you grow from the trauma. There is growth, because, and if you read all the psychology around that as well, we know that trauma is either debilitating or it helps people grow, and they grow into these wonderful people because they learn to live with that trauma, to accept that trauma, rather than developing a victim narrative from that.
So for me, the issue is that this idea of identity is absolutely crucial, because we are defining ourselves in opposition to other groups, other people. We're not defining ourselves rooted in being in reality.
And then it can become antagonistic or othering or differentiating.
Because if I've discovered there is some power that's ultimately controlling my existence, and then I connect with that, that's my identity. My definition of who I am comes from this vertical line. And that it's a liberating concept.
It
And
is,
for
yeah,
me,
because it
I
liberates you from all of these categories, doesn't it? Because you don't need to worry about them anymore. I've been, there is so much, I've interrupted, sorry, but there is so much being said now about microaggressions. And I don't want to invalidate that, but I think sometimes people become so sensitive to the microaggressions that happen around them that they tend to fixate on them and are not able to move beyond them. The fact is, in any society, there will be antagonism, there will be microaggressions, people will be treated because human beings tend to sometimes focus on differences. But actually, when you go beyond the differences, and I often say, and I say this to my sons as well, don't put yourself in a position where you feel defensive about who you are. Just see yourself as part of society and exercise active citizenship. And if somebody is misunderstanding you, just have a cup of tea with them and eat a samosa with them. And, bring
absolutely.
yourself to a place of commonality rather than becoming very defensive or doing the whole them versus us, because I think that the them versus us is incredibly damaging. But then those conversations do happen in households. I've heard those conversations
I mean,
myself, and I do try to keep
I
people
mean,
away
I
from
mean, I'll
that.
be honest.
Not
As a
helpful.
as a community, like you can see a lot of this, so how we react to news stories and how we react
Yes.
to things. And for me, this goes back to our relationship with something higher,
Yeah.
and it's not rooted.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'll finish off with this one of the concepts that's been a driving force in my kind of approach to life, and that is that no harm or no benefit can come to me
Mm,
other than from God.
exactly.
And if I have that concept, then I don't get angry at people because then ultimately it's from God.
Yeah.
Yeah, no benefit, no harm. And the moment you give the attribute to any other being or entity or person or event, then you've given an attribute that belongs to God
Yeah.
to somebody else. So therefore, you've given some of this, idea of worship and some of idea of that
Mhm.
power away
That, giving
from
them that power. Exactly.
where it should rightfully be
Yeah.
with your creator to something else.
Yes.
And I think that ultimately is that nobody can harm you or benefit you, and that's ultimately from the Quran, that's
Mm.
قُل لَن يُصِيبُنَا إِلَّا مَا كَتَبَ اللَّهُ لَنَا. Nothing will befall us calamity except what God wills for us. And if that is ultimately there, then that person might have been the outward cause for that bad thing happening to you, but they're not the ultimate cause.
Yeah.
And then that allows you to have that kind relationship with that person. You see beyond, you can transcend your
Exactly.
microaggressions,
You can
you can
transcend the
transcend
immediate.
all of
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
And I think this goes back to the point you were making earlier on. How do we ground this in our lived experience?
Mm.
So these are fundamental concepts in the Quran that we've been talking about today, like
Yeah.
beauty.
Yeah.
That's from the Quran.
Yeah.
Absolutely. God is beauty and he loves beautiful. Well, God is beautiful and he loves beauty.
Yeah.
And so and this idea of Abdullah from the Quran as well, this idea of connecting with nature, ponder upon nature and God's creation. These are all from there. And
Yeah.
then ultimately you develop a relationship
Mm.
with your creator. And this is why the word Rab is used, because everybody has their own understanding of their Rab. Yeah,
Yes.
based upon your lived experience.
Experience, exactly. No, that's incredibly powerful. And one thing that I will add to that, actually, which I find very inspiring, is in Surah Nisa, Allah starts Surah Nisa and he talks about the raham, or the womb.
Yeah.
And he says that don't break up the relationships of the womb. And what I tend to remind young people around me is that when Allah is talking about the womb, he's not just talking about our immediate mothers or our immediate relationships. He's actually, you could interpret that verse to actually say that he's telling us that we're all connected back to Adam and Eve. That's the womb where we come from. And so it does away with any of these ideas around racism and race and racial superiority or the supremacy narratives that we find. And we find supremacy narratives amongst Muslims as well. We find racist narratives among Muslims as well. But in the Quranic philosophical framework and moral framework, it's actually completely untenable, because once we connected to the womb, once we connected, we all come from the same parents. So we're all relationships. We're all in relationships. We're all actually, a large extended family. And I think seeing people like that means that we can then start to rise above. And we have to train ourselves. I've had to train myself as well around some of the stereotypes that I used to harbor and still do, but you become aware of that and you start to transcend some of that and think, right, oh, I had this really negative thought about somebody because I'm stereotyping that person. I shouldn't be doing that. I'm connected to that person. And I think we can then start nurturing those connections and raise children in an environment where they thrive and they don't see themselves as different from others or always focus on the differences or the them versus us. So we're better and they're worse. So they're better or we're worse. And all of the defensive narratives and the victim narratives that come from that, which I do think that for the community here in Britain, some of those narratives are incredibly damaging for young people and for women as well. I think it really marginalizes our women and puts them front and center of all of the identity politics that happens in this country. Can I now ask a final question? And I'm going to bring us back to your experience of working with children. And I want to mention for our audience here as well the wonderful, wonderful work that your wife, Anisa, does with you. And I want to say here that power couples are important. When both husband and wife work towards the same goal, when they're serving the community, when they're serving Islam like this, I think the effect of that, your partnership amplifies everything you do. It magnifies everything you do. There's a multiplier effect. So I think I do want to mention her. And I think that's important. There are other really inspiring people like Dr. Khalid Abul Fadl and his wife Grace Song, who are doing amazing work around Quran exegesis. They've just edited some of his Friday sermons, which have been published. Amazing work. My supervisor and his wife, again, they're both scholars in their own rights. They're doing wonderful work. And I would like to think that my husband and I, after 21 years together, of which we've spent about 15 or so just thinking Islam and reading Islam, have perhaps served one or two people, I would like to think. So I think there is something about that partnership. So mashallah, you have that. You have that.
No, I mean, I think that's really important. I mean, I would say that I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't for my wife.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah.
And then the reason for that is because you create that environment where you can nurture each other and grow together.
Yeah.
And like I was talking before, that ultimately, relationships is the most important thing, and the highest in human terms relationship you have is marriage.
Exactly.
And if you see each other as a reflection of the divine, that nurtures that rather than just you to individual beings with own interests and so on.
Exactly. Or competing with each other or pulling each other back. And I think that that team, it's a team, isn't it? So that team is so important.
It's certainly important that sometimes when you are reading off your own values, and like you say, it's always a battle. There is the ideal situation, but then we are surrounded by nurture conditioning of various types. And then it's important to have a person who can tell you as it is.
Yes, exactly.
Support you and not be scared of telling you as it is, and create that environment. And I think it's so important that those relationships that is so important. To marriage is such an important thing to nurture, to grow.
Exactly. To grow as individuals and to grow together.
Actually, because ultimately, if we were talking, we started off. Let's bring it back to the conversation. The Hadith Qudsi I mentioned, that God said that was me. And ultimately, you should see each other as a symbol of God, and you're interacting with God when you're interacting with each other.
Exactly. And that strengthens everything you do, and then gives you the resilience. I think what it fundamentally gives you is that resilience and that energy to carry on.
I think it's so important from a male perspective is that you provide the right environment for your partner, for your wife to grow, and create those opportunities. Don't just make it all about yourself or your own growth, but you create opportunities which we've done in our marriage, where he's been allowed to study and grow and in her own right. She's a person in her own right, and which rather than under my shadow.
Yes.
And I think that's really important that you nurture, you grow people. And one thing I haven't mentioned, when we talk about education, that education is all about leadership, and the sign of good leadership is that you produce other leaders.
Exactly.
And that starts with the home.
And that starts with the home. Absolutely. I completely agree with you. So a person, who's able to live their own life, but who have shared goals with you, they have their own dreams and wishes and desires, but those shared goals as well. And I think the role model, so when you're producing that leader, you're also producing a role model. That role model for the next generation of children to see that this is how their parents have worked together. This is how their parents have worked as equals, consulting with each other, talking to each other, and creating something so impactful for the community. So I think it is fantastic, and I do really admire as well, where due credit is given, because I think sometimes credit isn't given to women often. But I see so many women working in the background. I mean, even I've seen even in my family where women are actually doing all the cooking for something which is happening in the mosque, but actually their names are never mentioned. And I'm like, well, this is the person who's woke up at 5 in the morning and cooked all this food. Perhaps mention their name and make sure that they're given credit. So I wanted to make sure that I do that, and say thank you to Anisa as well,
Absolutely.
because of all the work that she does. And I've met her many times, and she's such a wonderful person. Bringing us back then to both the work that you and Anisa have both been doing with children. I think one of the things that would really benefit our listeners, especially those who are parents and who are grappling with, raising children now, as I said, in a hypersexualized world, huge amounts of peer pressure, all kinds of awful information which children can get from social media. We know that social media contagion is a real problem, and it's affecting children's mental health. It's affecting the decision and sometimes life-changing decisions that they make. What would be your tips? What would be your reflections around the challenges of raising children today and giving them that kind of grounded sense of who they are, as Muslims, and the moral worldview that they have, because they're challenged about it all the time, and they can feel quite underconfident about it as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
See, that's such a
I know we could do
powerful
another two
question.
hours on this,
Um,
but
I'm going to answer it in with three questions.
okay.
Okay, so for every child, so first of all, they need to know, who am I?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, who am I? That's so important, and that who am I can't be answered until you have some relationship with something higher than you. And so take them outdoors, nature, get them to meet people, and then they will discover
Who
God
they are.
through
Yeah.
nature,
Yeah.
through people, looking at history, looking at events. And so with all of the mindset, yeah, there is a force out there. There's a force, there's a power, there's a consciousness, there's intelligence out there, which you can't deny,
Mm-hmm.
which is there. And that lays the foundations for revelation. And then that power can communicate with us. So that's the first thing. Who am I? The second would be, what's real? Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think living in a world where what is real, we don't know. And this goes back to um, epistemology,
Mm-hmm.
and ontology. What is real? Is the physical the only real thing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or our thoughts real? Our emotions real? Is mathematical relationships, are they real? So what is real? And I think that's something that will address once you look at what's real. So what's real isn't just the material world. There are Our soul is real,
Mm-hmm.
our emotions are real, our feelings are real, our memories are real. And so when you look at this idea, what is real, and go beyond the physical, that then also lays the foundation of connecting with the spiritual world as well. Okay. And
Yeah.
then the third is, how do I know what I know? Yeah. And that's epistemology. So the
Yeah.
first was ontology, and the second is, how do I know what I know? Okay. And do I know, am I just following, what people have told me, what I've come across, peer pressure? How do I know what I know?
Mm-hmm.
And just that critical awareness now will stop you from then getting lost, or just following the things that might look appealing, or are coming from some social influencer and so on. But then you need that critical
Just the
faculty. How do I
criticality.
know
Yeah.
what I know? So that would be my top three things. So who am I? And that's again relationship, that identity. I'm Abdullah. Yeah, I'm nothing. I'm not, a Pakistani or this, or a BME,
Mm.
or from a socioeconomic. I'm none of those. Yeah,
Mm.
those metrics that are used to define us do not define me. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's not who I am. Yeah, who I am is, I am what Jesus said. Qala inni Abdullah. That's who I am. And
Mm-hmm.
then secondly, what is real? Yeah, what is real? Actually, angels are real.
Mm-hmm.
Spiritual beings are real, but they work in a different dimension.
Yeah.
And so they can't be proven. It's like I can't use a sieve to capture everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's like certain things. I mean, water doesn't exist if I use a sieve.
Exactly.
So the tools are not appropriate
Yeah.
for that. And so this idea, what is real, it's really important that we teach our children and ground at a very young age.
Mm.
That actually what makes you. What's the difference between a cadaver and a real person?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not the physical body.
It's the
something
soul.
else.
It's the soul and the consciousness and the self-aware. Yeah.
We call it the soul, but
The
it's
life
something
force.
we can't.
Yeah.
We call it soul. You can call it whatever you want, but
Yeah.
we know there's something non-physical that animates us. That And the last thing, how do I know what I know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do I know it through somebody's told me? Is it through my own reflections? Is it through my own life experiences? Is it through my own observations? How is it through revelation? Is it on authority?
Mm-hmm.
How do I know what I know? Yeah, and then be critical about that.
And be critical, exactly.
About that,
Yeah.
So those are my 3 top tips.
Yeah.
To raise amazing children.
I know it is, and they are amazing. And every time I talk to children, I talk to my children, and I say this to my husband as well. I think children today are just amazing. They are wise, they are well informed, they genuinely care about things around them. It's our job as parents to nurture those attributes in them. I honestly, teenagers get such bad press, but I find them to be the loveliest of people, so well informed, so genuinely caring. And I think my experience of parenting, I have felt, and yes, as a parent, it's not a science, you make mistakes. And I look back and I think, oh, I could have done this differently. I'm sure that, you also go through such moments, and I've gone through some crisis of confidence as well as a parent. But the 2 things that have stood out for me when I reflect is one, what you've mentioned just now, the fact that we need to take out the time to have conversations with our children. And those conversations, the patience that we exercise, listening to them and respecting their viewpoint is really important. Genuinely listening to them, not just being authoritarian towards them or only just giving them rules and regulations and discipline, but actually listening to them. And in that conversation, then helping them build that criticality. Helping them. So yes, now you've seen something from a social media influencer. Hang on a minute. Let's read about them a little bit. Let's see who they are. Let's see how they define success. Is this our definition of success? Do we have a different definition of success in our household? Can people have different definitions of success? Is it only about money? Is it only about owning branded goods? What happens when you buy something branded? How does that add to your self-esteem? And I think all those conversations help us build criticality. Ironically, because parents are so busy, they don't take out the time for conversation. So you give a to-do list to your child and you say, right, have you done your homework? And I've been there as well when I've been really busy. And my sons have then said to me, Mom, all you do is ask us questions about whether we've done this or not. So I'll be asking them, have you done your assignment? Have you submitted this? Have you signed this form? And then you have to step back from it and realize, oh my God, I am making some serious errors here. I just need to take out time where I can sit with my child, enjoy a cup of tea or coffee, and just have a conversation with them, or just sit in the garden and just listen to them. And it doesn't have to be about tasks, and it doesn't have to be about discipline, but just helping. And I think it is in those moments that we have that genuine connection with them, and we can help them build that criticality. And it's a gentle process. And I think the more authoritarian we are, I think parents do get very scared. They become very terrified when they see these influences on the children. And the natural reaction is to become quite authoritarian and try to control their behavior. And that has the opposite effect, which is that the child rebels even more and starts to disrespect you and leaves the bounds of what you're trying to set. So those kind of have been, my lessons from raising children.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the things that I'm working on the moment with the people is looking at a spiritual curriculum. Because if you look at a lot of the curriculums that are followed in the maktab and the madaris, they all focus on content.
Yes.
Yeah, information and content, and so, but not about this development of relationship with something higher, bigger, character development. Because you can't teach character development in a classroom. No. Yeah, these life skills.
It's only through experiences.
And that's one of the reasons why I got involved in scouting, because I think it's so important that children develop life skills through a lived experience where they're engaging with children in a non-academic environment, in a social, cultural environment, and they're living those values. Life learning to get on with people, cooking for themselves, and supporting each other. So those life skills are so. And that was one of the reasons that kind of prompted me to look at. To me, even though I'm in education, I think this element is still missing from education. Is life skills.
Life skills is missing. Yeah.
Our curriculums are so focused on content.
Yeah.
And we don't. So children leave school. They might pass the exams, but what they don't have is that confident, expressive personalities that are grounded in their
being able to articulate themselves. Yes. Yeah.
And this goes back to the point we were making before, in the importance of the arts, including expressive arts, not just music.
Yeah.
Drama is important, expressive arts and expression is so important as well.
Yeah.
So this idea of a spiritual curriculum, I think this is where, as a community, we need to be moving towards, moving
Yeah.
away from all these glossy books that have been produced, which are focused on the rulings and fiqh,
No.
and moving towards, like it's almost like a Muslim survival toolkit for
Yeah.
children to develop the ground. And this spiritual toolkit would transcend religions and borders, really.
Yeah. And
Because
sectarian divides. And sectarian divides.
it lays the foundation
Yeah.
of a relationship with something higher.
Yeah.
And at the moment, we don't lay that foundation. Therefore, we get very dogmatic about these things because then we get challenged. So
Yeah.
the whole idea of developing a person, a relationship with God, and it's really interesting. Like I mentioned earlier, if you look at the seerah, what was happening in year 1, year 2, year 3 of the Prophet's life, prophethood, and then looking at the chronological surahs that were revealed at the time and cross-referencing what was happening in the life of the Prophet, the challenges, and then the surahs, how those surahs then allowed them. You'll find some amazing lessons of how we can deal with life today as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just picking up your point about life skills and bringing it back to the mundane, and asking my children to tidy up after themselves, do the dishes, dry them, put them away. Do we have to put them away? Yes, you have to put them away. And yes, you're on a rota for scrubbing bathrooms as well, because that is an essential life skill and that is character developing. So I think sometimes it's the basic stuff that we need to get right to have our children feel more grounded and more confident. It's been an amazing discussion, and I'm sure that we could sit here for another 2 hours and look at kind of finer points of everything we've talked about. But I do really appreciate the time you've taken. I know how busy you are. It's been an amazing conversation. Thank you very much. And I hope that at some point we can have you back, maybe discussing something different like the coherence of the Quran, which I know that we've had various discussions on in the past. But Jazakallah, thank you so much for featuring in this. And I'm looking forward to releasing this video. I'm sure that our audience will really enjoy it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.